This presentation is about green public procurement, a topical subject, as yesterday the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Bill was published. Curiously, it doesn't mention procurement at all, or green procurement as one of the ways to reduce our carbon emissions and to improve energy efficiency. Notwithstanding, I think green public procurement will become quite an important feature of procurement and indeed tendering, as the programme for government has stated very clearly that GPP will become mandatory in some form in the course of the next few years. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things, primarily the European Union guidance. There's national guidance as well, introducing sustainability criteria, which is very important for both buyers and suppliers. There's quite a few new developments happening, which I'd like to keep you briefed about. Lots of sources of information. And you'd be glad to know, if you're very interested in green public procurement, that the European Commission has a 7-series training program on GPP, and I've actually based this presentation on some of that material. So we start off with an introduction. We talk about the strategic aspects of green public procurement. There's some legal aspects and how to run a tender competition with sustainability criteria. It is best practice for contracting authorities, buyers, to carry out a needs assessment before they embark on putting green public procurement into their tenders. We talk a little bit about circular procurement, and then finally give you some advices on one particular category, just to illustrate how green public procurement works in practice. So what is this famous green public procurement? Well, you see the definition here. It's a process whereby public bodies, contracting authorities, wish to procure goods, services, and works, all three, and the purpose is to reduce the environmental impact through the life cycle of the purchase compared to the current situation. So it's very much about reducing environmental impacts, reducing energy efficiency, improving the productivity of the use of energy, recycling, and it's also about helping us cut our carbon emissions. So every product that we buy or supply consumes raw material. It uses scarce resources, including water. It emits carbon, it emits methane. It generates waste. It uses a lot of consumables. And there are toxic emissions. So if you're a buyer, a public buyer, part of what green public procurement will do for you is to say, how in publishing my next tender can I reduce the environmental impacts, as I've just mentioned? And for you, the supplier, you're to produce a solution to the buyer to tell them how you're going to do it. What's the driver? Well, the Climate Action Plan. It's being revised and it's due to be published, the revised version, I understand, later this year. It'll be somewhat changed from what was published 2 years ago. It will be well informed by the bill that was published yesterday. And I think most public bodies are going to be asked, what is their carbon footprint? What is their carbon budget? And how are they going to cut this by 2030 in the first instance? And one of the ways to do this is through smart, sustainable procurement, GPP. There are targets that have to be met. The public sector has to reduce its emissions by 30%. Most major bodies, including local authorities, have to have a climate action plan, and energy efficiency also must be improved, all by way of legal requirements. This is not a voluntary arrangement. This is a very significant, across the EU, across the world, legal set of compliances. So how does procurement fit into this? Well, the government last October, 12 months, issued a circular on environmental considerations, basically telling the chief executives and the accountable officers of the public sector to include environmental considerations in their tenders. But what happens in practice? You read the small print. Well, the small print, it addresses the circular primarily at departments. It does not address public bodies who are not departments. And basically, there's an encouragement to consider using green procurement. That falls well short of what's required. We cannot and will not meet our emissions reduction targets on the basis of encouragement. Maybe that language will change now that the carbon bill has been introduced. But what they're looking for are clearly quantifiable, verifiable, and measurable criteria that can reduce the impact of the environment when we build works or consume goods or deliver services. However, the circular also states, which is a disappointment, that the cost must be met within existing budgets. Now, if that's the case, this green procurement will never take off, because green public procurement does and has to, by definition, include some extra costs. There is new guidance in the pipeline. This is the old guidance produced by the EPA some time ago. It is being revised at the moment in the context of the Programme for Government Commitment to have compulsory green public procurement by the end of the Programme for Government. Now, that's not going to be practical, to be quite honest, for all tenders, and I would suspect the line might be drawn in relation to tenders above the EU threshold. Anything below that, I think, would be too much of a burden. But what will inform everything is the European Union Green Deal is pushing for mandatory requirements. This will require legislation, and that's one of the reasons why I was quite surprised to see that there's no mention of mandatory procurement in the carbon bill produced yesterday. There are some legal requirements already in place. SEAI's EEE register is one of them. The Department of Environment, Climate and Communications is taking the lead, and we have to await the publication of this new guide. At EU level, they're not waiting about. There is an enormous amount of guidance available. This is one such document. If you want examples of best practice, if you want examples of sustainability criteria, if you want technical notes, you go to the European Union. And for example, I hope you can read this slide. Every single major product that is potentially covered has significant technical papers available, be they computers, monitors, cleaning products, office building, public space maintenance, road lighting, traffic signals, road design, paints, varnishes, you name it. They're for a significant percent, and I reckon nearly 50% of everything that's covered by procurement, there is sectoral guidance available. So if you're, as a supplier, bidding into the public sector, you should be looking at the products or processes that are sustainable. And if you're a buyer, you should be picking the processes or standards that are fit for purpose for your requirement. There's a help desk available at EU level. They're the contacts. More particularly, there's a huge amount of information available, which I'll share with you later. So what is a green public procurement strategy? Well, in essence, it's using smart procurement techniques to help reduce environmental impacts. Many public bodies, through their corporate procurement plans, have a very well developed corporate procurement strategy. But what's missing from many of them is the sustainability piece. And that's what's coming through the guidance that has been published by the EPA and the Office of Government Procurement. Why is a procurement strategy important for GPP? Well, effectively, it will integrate sustainable procurement into wider procurement activities by integrating, for example, sustainable green award criteria or selection criteria. I'll talk about this in a few minutes. Obviously, the emphasis is the benefits that are evident from green public procurement. Apart from meeting policy goals, it improves financial efficiency, it improves organizational representation, it addresses the issue of risk where environmental compliance is compulsory, and most particularly, it encourages suppliers to be innovative, which I think is one of the most important parts of green public procurement. So you're in an organization local authority, health board, hospital, who runs the show? Well, you do need to have a champion in your organization that will lead the green public procurement strategy. And indeed, for suppliers, who in your organization is best equipped to blend in the green sustainable criteria and solutions that you're going to be asked for? Who are the main stakeholders internally and externally? And most particularly, who become the repository of know-how for all of this, which is quite a complicated area, one would have to admit. So the procurement rules apply to green public procurement. Just adding in green public procurement just adds in little extra dimensions to the normal way of procuring or issuing a tender. You can put in environmental management systems as a selection criteria. You can add eco labels. You can add life cycle costs. They're a bit complicated, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It's also the new directive, well, it's not new anymore, allows the rejection of tenderers that don't meet environmental obligations, either by the primary contractor or by the subcontractors. The new forthcoming guidance will address two very important issues. There is a major difference, but a subtle difference between core criteria and comprehensive criteria when it comes to GPP. Essentially, core criteria are those that are easy to use. They're designed for the minimum requirement in terms of verification, and there's very little cost increases. So obviously this is the area that will be the focus initially for most activity in procurement. When we get used to the language and the jargon and how it works, I think the public sector will then look for comprehensive criteria, which involves significant extra costs, significant extra verification, and very detailed and cumbersome calculation of life cycle costs. So the procurement process with GPP isn't any different. You assess the need, you produce your business case, you engage with the market. If you're into recycling or reuse or the circular economy, what product can you produce, or what should your standards be? Can the market produce them? And this is a critically important part of the new guidance to be produced. Most Irish suppliers, SMEs, this is brand new to them. Most suppliers aren't used to having environmental standards or having to produce and source environmental products. So there's going to have to be a sort of an understanding by buyers that the Irish suppliers will probably need a little bit of time to gear up and have their supply chain sorted out before major tenders can be responded to. So when you're designing as a buyer the tender, I think it's very important to realize what is available in the Irish marketplace and indeed in Europe generally. If you, as a bidder, don't comply with environmental considerations, your bid, as would normally be the case, will be rejected. When the bids come in, there will be award criteria against which marks will be given, and some of these will have sustainability criteria, and I'll talk about how that might be done now in a short while. When you get your results letters, if you fall short on your green public procurement writing or your bid, you should and will get debriefing. The whole purpose, I think, in this exercise is to give everyone the opportunity to continuously improve what's on offer in the marketplace. And it behoves the Office of Government Procurement to share the know-how that they will get once green public procurement becomes more systematic across the public sector. Evaluating tenders is also going to be a little bit extra difficult for the public sector. As I mentioned earlier, the companies that don't comply with environmental standards or have had a bad track record could potentially be excluded. It is well possible, and it'd be very understandable for public buyers to set high and important selection criteria. Like if, for example, a tender was very much in relation to, say, an appropriate assessment consultancy, you probably would want to insist upon having IMAS ISO 14001 or the equivalent environmental management standards, certified standards, to be available to the tenderers who are going to do the work. There are supply chain issues as well, and there are human resource issues in terms of who, if you have a sustainability officer in your organization, that would be a significant boost if you're bidding for a large tender. And obviously, track record. Many companies in Ireland don't have many examples of tenders where green public procurement has been used. And unfortunately, until things change, that's going to be quite a problem. The technical specifications that are going to be asked of will be quite demanding. The EU has set very high standards, and Irish suppliers will have to meet with these. And the standards will filter into the award criteria. Standards such as eco labels, certificates, etc., will all become pretty commonplace once green public procurement is spread out throughout the public sector. One of the key issues, if you're a supplier and you want to stay in this game and you want to be competitive, you really would have to look at getting EMAS or an ISO 14001. This is the standard for environmental management compliance. And companies that have this will have a competitive advantage. You may be building up to this, which is one thing, but if a buyer is really interested in your environmental credentials, there is no substitute for IMAS 14001 as a certifiable standard. It's not all easy. Life cycle costing is a nightmare, to be honest. It is very difficult for the public sector to calculate the life cycle costs of an awful lot of products. Why? Because there's no standard formula. There are any number of possibilities. The European Union, as you can see from this slide, has various modules and guidelines and technical notes and user guides, etc., and a GPP calculator. So it's very difficult for, I would say, the vast majority of public buyers to calculate these life cycle costs. Hence the comment I made earlier on, that if GPP becomes compulsory in the public sector, it should only be for the contracts over the EU threshold, in other words, for high value contracts. There is guidance, thankfully. So when you get the slides here, you can click on the hyperlink to get your guidance as to how to do your life cycle costs. And life cycle costs are different from life cycle assessments. The life cycle costs will calculate the cost, for example, of a product through its life cycle, including environmental externalities, whereas the life cycle assessment looks at impacts, which is quite separate from costs, again, over the lifetime of the product or service. One of the starting points, or the starting point for nearly every public body in Ireland, is to assess how you can embed GPP into your procurement strategy. And to do that, you need to carry out a needs assessment. The EU toolkit for training on GPP has a separate module on this, which I'm only referencing very, very briefly. But you do need to look at things like unnecessary purchases. Why would you repurchase computers if the ones you have can actually be reused? Why are you looking for certain products of a very high standard or products of a lower standard consuming fewer raw materials could be purchased? So there's quite a few decisions to be taken. You'll also discover that a significant amount of what you're procuring isn't suitable for green public procurement. Green public procurement applies to about 50% of the categories that are commonly purchased. So each organization, I think over the next year or two, will do an audit of what potentially could be covered by green public procurement. And for those products and services and works, the rules will be introduced gradually. So what are the categories and subcategories in your organization, if you're a buyer, that are amenable to green public procurement? And as a supplier, can you, and to what extent can you offer services or goods, or indeed manage works that are compliant or going to be compliant with sustainability issues? A lot of consultation would be required. At the end of the day, a lot of the purchases that we take for granted will not take place, because you'll discover that you're procuring particularly goods where you're over requiring ordering too much paper or ordering too much electricity, and you need to cut back. This is all in the context of a much wider discussion of sustainable and circular procurement. The Dublin Chamber Sustainability Academy is a very good source of material for presentations on the circular economy. And indeed, Enterprise Ireland have a number of advisors in this space. I should add, we're one of them, to help you understand better what the circular economy means if you're a supplier and indeed if you're a buyer. So effectively, you're looking not just at refuse, but looking at recycling. And that has become and will become a much more important part of our economy for reasons I'll explain in a short while. So it's about getting the best use from resources. And if you're purchasing something, can you get an equivalent product that isn't using as many scarce resources? What is its life cycle? Will it last 6 years or 10 years? And if it is to be recycled, how's the best way to do it? And there are some key sectors where this is very, very applicable, including electronics, batteries, packaging, plastic. And in Ireland, considering that nearly half of our public expenditure on procurement goes through capital projects, works, building and demolition waste, and obviously food and water, which is procured on a very regular basis. Are you over procuring your food requirements? That's waste. Irish policy is, like most other things, informed by European policy, and there is a circular economy action plan in the system as part of the European Green Deal. And with a little bit of luck, there'll be some EU funding and grant aid coming through once this budget and programme is up and running. This is another nice diagram to show what the circular economy is about. It's about suppliers designing better products, consuming less raw material for a longer life cycle, encouraging reuse, investing in reuse and recycling infrastructure, and developing markets for recycled material. This is a big change, but it's all part of our commitment to reduce carbon and to have a much better economy that is more energy efficient. I'm going to spend and conclude just looking at one particular product category, which is ICT. See there in the bottom right-hand corner, it takes 240 kilograms of fossil fuel, 22 kilograms of chemicals, and wait for it, 1,500 kilograms of water to make a PC. Did you know that? Well, if you did, would you order 100 when you only needed 50? So what this is about is creating awareness through the technical guides that the European Union has produced for you as a purchaser to realize these are the resource implications of consuming or procuring a particular product, in this case, a computer. To address this, and suppliers need to be aware of this as well, there are very strict standards set at EU level. You can get them from the technical notes I referenced earlier for computer monitors, for notebooks, for tablets, for desktops, for servers, for phones, for management equipment. So there's a very significant number of EU sustainability standards in the ICT space. So if you want to get sustainable products, you put these standards in as a mandatory requirement into your tenders. And you also insist that the supplier looks after WEEE, which is the waste electronic recycling arrangements, which is another EU requirement. Now, this is a different way of procuring computers. There are eco-design labels for computers and servers. There's energy efficiency issues around battery life. There are very clear operational procedures to be used. It's covered by the REACH directive and the Energy Efficiency Directive. I know this is all very complicated, but this is where procurement is going in the next couple of years. So it's a matter of getting ready for what's going to be quite a change, a step change in procuring if we want to reduce our carbon emissions and improve our energy efficiency. So buyers will try to produce or to purchase the most efficient, energy efficient models. They will look for durability. They're not going to look for models that are going to have to be thrown into the skip after 5 years. They will look for products that have a longer lifespan and can be recycled. As I mentioned at the outset, there's one thing is not short of in this particular area is information. And through the hyperlinks here, you will be able to get an abundance of information. All the product criteria for all the products I mentioned are available at EU level. There is a very efficient help desk available. You can ask them through email. The program GGP4 also gives you examples of best practice. The EU has a handbook to show you how it's done, and the OECD as well have produced very interesting guidance. So there's no short of material about how to do it, but what we're missing now is actually doing it. Very, very few tenders in Ireland include and embed green public procurement. And with the carbon bill enacted or brought into the Oireachtas yesterday, one would have an expectation that green procurement will become one of the policy instruments to deliver carbon reductions and to improve our energy efficiency. And this covers works, goods, and services. Works in particular is a challenge, and I would hope and expect that when the guidance is published by the EPA very soon, that the construction industry is one of the industries covered by green public procurement. That's me done on green public procurement. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope you learned something from the presentation. And if you have any queries or questions, as always, my phone number is there, and we're very happy to take emails and to answer to the best of our ability what we can do to help you green your tender bids. Thank you very much.